The wind moved low across the open land as dusk settled over the small border town of Red Willow, carrying dust, quiet, and the smell of dry earth, and in that gentle hour before night fully claimed the sky, Anna May stood alone near the edge of the livery stable, watching the fading light stretch long shadows across the road, her hands folded tight in front of her as if holding herself together, because she had learned that stillness was sometimes the only way to survive a heart that felt too full and too empty at the same time. And she had come to Red Willow not to be seen but to disappear, leaving behind a past that pressed too hard against her chest whenever she tried to breathe freely, a past filled with promises spoken too quickly and left behind just as fast, and she told herself that this town, small and quiet, was meant to be a stopping place, nothing more, yet something about the air made her feel as though the land itself was listening, waiting to see if she would stay or move on, and it was in that still moment that she heard the sound of slow footsteps behind her, steady and unhurried, the kind that belonged to someone who did not rush life because life had already taught him patience, and when she turned she saw Thomas Hale, the man who had offered her work only 3 days earlier without asking many questions, a tall cowboy with tired eyes and a calm way of standing that made the world seem less sharp around the edges, and though they had spoken little since her arrival, she felt his presence before he spoke, as if the quiet between them had already begun to shape something neither of them could name. And he stopped a respectful distance away, his hat low, his voice gentle when he asked if she was settling in all right, and Anna answered with a small nod, not trusting her voice yet, because kindness still felt dangerous to her, and Thomas seemed to understand that, because he did not press her, instead standing beside her and looking out at the road as if sharing silence was enough, and in that shared quiet Anna felt something loosen inside her, a tiny release she had not allowed herself in a long time. And she wondered why the presence of a near stranger felt safer than places she had once called home, and as the sky deepened into shades of blue and gold, Thomas spoke again, saying the nights could turn cold fast and she should not stay out too long, his concern simple and without demand, and she thanked him softly, surprised by how much weight such small words could carry, and as he turned to leave, something inside her urged her to speak, to stop him, though she did not know why, and the words slipped out before she could pull them back, telling him that the quiet here felt different, and Thomas paused, glancing back at her with a look that held both understanding and something unspoken, and he said that quiet could either heal or remind a person of what they were trying to forget, depending on how long they stayed still enough to listen, and with that he walked away, leaving Anna standing there with a strange ache in her chest, because she felt seen in a way that unsettled her, and that night she lay awake in the small room above the kitchen where she had been given space to sleep, listening to the sounds of the town settling into rest, and her thoughts drifted back to Thomas's calm voice, to the way he did not look at her as if he expected anything, and that unsettled her more than longing ever had, because longing was familiar but peace was not, and the next days passed quickly, filled with work and small exchanges, with Thomas appearing in quiet moments, never staying long, always respectful, and Anna began to notice the weight he carried too, the way his smile did not always reach his eyes, the way he sometimes paused as if remembering something painful before continuing on, and she wondered what kind of loss had shaped him into a man who spoke gently and moved carefully through the world, and one afternoon as the sun burned high and the town seemed frozen in heat, Anna sat on the porch steps, resting her tired hands when Thomas approached again, offering her water, their fingers brushing briefly as she took it, the contact light but enough to send a sharp awareness through her, and she pulled back quickly, apologizing without knowing why, and Thomas lifted his hand slightly as if to say there was no harm done, his eyes kind but distant, and he said nothing, and that silence felt heavier than words, because Anna realized she was afraid of how easily she could imagine standing closer to him, talking longer, letting herself hope for something she had sworn she would never want again. And as days turned into weeks, Red Willow began to feel less like a place to hide and more like a place that asked quiet questions she was not ready to answer, and Thomas became a steady presence, always nearby but never pushing, and Anna found herself watching the road at dusk again, waiting without admitting it, until one evening Thomas did not appear, and an unexpected worry took root in her chest, surprising her with its strength, and when he finally arrived later than usual, his expression worn and thoughtful, Anna felt relief she tried to hide, and they stood together under the growing stars, speaking of nothing important, yet everything felt heavy with meaning, and when Anna finally said that she was not sure how long she would stay in Red Willow, Thomas nodded slowly, saying people came and went, but some places left marks that stayed longer than expected, and she looked at him then, really looked, and wondered if he was one of those marks already forming in her life, and the thought frightened her enough that she turned away, excusing herself for the night, leaving Thomas standing alone under the sky, watching her go with an expression that suggested he too was fighting a quiet battle. And as Anna closed her door and leaned against it, her heart racing with emotions she had no words for, she realized that leaving might hurt less than staying, but staying might mean facing something she had avoided for far too long. And outside, Thomas lingered a moment longer before walking away, carrying with him the same question that haunted her thoughts, because sometimes the most dangerous thing was not heartbreak itself, but the hope that followed close behind. And as the town of Red Willow settled into sleep, two lives moved quietly closer without touching, unaware of how much the next choice could change everything. The sun stood high and unforgiving over Red Mesa when Clara Boone arrived, her black dress dusted pale from travel and her face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide brim, and the town seemed to hold its breath the moment she stepped down from the wagon, because her name had reached this place long before her boots touched the ground, carried by whispers that slipped through saloons and back rooms, whispered with fear and fascination, stories of a woman who loved men marked by trouble and buried them just as fast, and Clara felt those whispers settle on her shoulders like another layer of grief she had learned to carry in silence, because she had not come to Red Mesa to stir fear or chase rumors but to claim the small house left to her by a distant aunt, a place far from the memories that clung to her like thorns. And as she walked down the single dusty street, eyes followed her with caution, men tipping hats without warmth, women watching with guarded curiosity, and Clara kept her gaze steady ahead, because she had learned that meeting those looks only invited questions she could not answer without reopening wounds that never truly healed. And she spent her first days quietly, unpacking little, sleeping poorly, listening to the wind at night as it swept over the desert and reminded her of how alone she was. And loneliness was not new to her, but it still found ways to ache, especially in the quiet hours before dawn. And it was on the fourth night, when the heat lingered heavy even after sunset, that fate arrived. Bleeding on her doorstep, because Clara heard a sound outside her door, not a knock but a collapse, a body meeting earth. And though fear rose quickly in her chest, it was followed by something stronger, an old instinct to help even when helping had cost her dearly before. And when she opened the door she found a man crumpled against the step, his shirt dark with blood, his breath shallow, his face drawn tight with pain, and she recognized him at once though she had never seen him before, because Red Mesa had spoken of Luke Calder too, a gunslinger passing through, dangerous but fair, a man with a past written in scars and rumors. And Clara stood frozen for only a moment before kneeling beside him, pulling him inside with more strength than she believed she still had. And as she worked through the night cleaning his wound, her hands steady despite the fear pounding in her chest, she told herself she was only doing what was right, that she would tend to him and send him on his way, because loving a man like Luke Calder was a path she knew too well and one she had sworn never to walk again. And Luke drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring things she could not make sense of. But when his eyes finally opened and settled on her, there was no fear there, only surprise and something softer, and he thanked her in a voice rough with pain and exhaustion, and Clara told him to rest, her tone firm but gentle, and for days she kept him hidden in her small home, aware that the town would not look kindly on her sheltering a wounded gunslinger, especially one with enemies close behind. And as Luke slowly regained strength, a quiet bond formed between them, built not on grand gestures but on shared silences, on the way he watched her move through the small rooms with care, on the way she listened when he spoke of nothing important, because both of them carried histories that made words heavy. And Luke noticed the way Clara flinched at sudden sounds, the way she paused at the mention of violence, and he did not ask, because he understood that some stories were not meant to be pulled open before they were ready. And Clara noticed the way Luke stared at the ceiling at night, jaw tight, as if fighting memories that came uninvited, and she would bring him water or sit nearby without speaking. And in those quiet moments something dangerous began to grow, a feeling neither of them named, because naming it would give it power. And the town noticed changes too, men whispering that the widow had taken in another outlaw, that death would surely follow, and Clara felt the weight of those rumors pressing in, stirring old guilt, old fears that perhaps she was cursed, that those she cared for were doomed by nothing more than her affection. And one evening as the sky burned red and gold, she finally spoke of it, telling Luke what the town said about her, about the men she had loved and lost, her voice steady but her hands trembling, and Luke listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. And when she finished he said simply that death followed men like him long before they ever met women like her, and his words settled something deep inside her, because for the first time someone did not look at her as a bad omen but as a woman who had survived loss, and that night the space between them felt smaller, charged with an emotion both tender and frightening, and though nothing passed between them beyond a shared look held a moment too long, Clara felt her heart begin to open despite her fear, and Luke felt it too, a pull toward a future he had never allowed himself to imagine, and as his strength returned, danger crept closer, because men searching for Luke rode into Red Mesa asking questions, their presence sharp and unwelcome, and Clara saw the tension settle into Luke's shoulders, and she knew what was coming even before he spoke, because men like him did not bring trouble quietly, and when Luke told her he would leave before trouble reached her door, Clara felt a sharp pain bloom in her chest, because part of her had hoped, foolishly, that this story might end differently, and she wanted to tell him to stay, to risk it, but fear wrapped tight around her words, and instead she nodded, telling him she understood, and as they stood in the doorway under the fading light, Luke thanked her again, not just for saving his life but for reminding him what it felt like to be treated with kindness, and Clara watched him walk away, her heart heavy but resigned, believing that loving from a distance was safer, and yet fate was not finished, because before Luke could leave town, gunfire cracked through the air, echoing off the buildings, and Clara's breath caught as fear surged, and she ran toward the sound without thinking, because fear for someone else had always been stronger than fear for herself, and when she reached the edge of town she saw Luke standing wounded again, facing men who had come to finish what they started, and time seemed to slow as Clara realized the choice before her, to turn away and survive, or to stand and risk losing everything once more, and as Luke glanced back and saw her there, shock and something deeper crossed his face, because in that moment he understood that her heart had already stepped into danger alongside his, and the desert wind carried the sound of raised voices, of weapons being readied, and Clara felt the familiar ache of fate closing in, the same cruel pattern threatening to repeat itself, and yet beneath the fear was something new, a quiet resolve, because if tragedy came, she would not meet it by running this time, and as the sun dipped low, painting the land in fire and shadow, Clara took a step forward, knowing that whatever followed would change both their lives forever, and the town of Red Mesa watched in tense silence as love and loss stood once again on the edge of violence, waiting to see which would claim its due. Deadwood Crossing lay beneath a sky the color of old steel, a town worn thin by years without order, where doors stayed barred even in daylight and hope had learned to keep quiet, and into that uneasy stillness rode Caleb Ward, his shoulders slumped, his coat faded, and a tarnished marshal's badge tucked half-hidden beneath the dust of the road, a badge he had not worn in years and never intended to wear again, because the last time he carried it openly, everything he loved had been taken from him piece by piece, leaving behind a man who learned how to keep moving without believing in a rival, and the townsfolk watched him with suspicion as he dismounted near the empty sheriff's office, his boots touching the ground like a question no one wanted to answer, because Deadwood Crossing had learned to fear lawmen as much as outlaws, having been abandoned too many times when things turned hard, and Caleb felt their eyes on him, felt the familiar weight of regret settle into his bones, but he had come only to pass through, or so he told himself, following a rumor of work further west, a place where no one knew his name or his failures, yet the town seemed to pull at him with quiet insistence, as if it recognized something broken and familiar in his slow steps and tired gaze, and when he pushed open the door to the old office, dust rose in soft clouds, revealing cracked walls and a desk scarred by time, and the sight stirred memories he had buried deep, of nights spent writing reports by lamplight, of promises made to people who believed in him once, promises he had not been strong enough to keep, and he stood there longer than he meant to, until a voice from the doorway broke the silence, an older man named Samuel Price, one of the few still willing to speak plainly, who asked if Caleb was staying, and Caleb answered honestly that he did not know, and Samuel told him Deadwood Crossing was on the edge of something bad, that a gang had been circling, taking what they wanted, testing the town's fear, and Caleb felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old instinct stirring despite his resistance, because he had run from places like this before, telling himself it was survival, but deep down he knew it had been fear wearing a reasonable face, and as the day wore on, he saw the signs everywhere, the way people avoided open spaces, the way voices dropped when strangers passed, and he realized that lawlessness did not always arrive with noise, sometimes it settled quietly, teaching people to expect nothing better, and that night Caleb sat alone on the steps of the office, staring at the badge in his hand, turning it over like a coin that could buy forgiveness, and memories came uninvited, of a town much like this one, of a moment when he hesitated instead of acting, when he chose caution over courage, and how that single pause had cost lives he had sworn to protect, including someone he loved more than the badge itself, and the weight of that failure had driven him away from the law, convinced him that good intentions were not enough to stop bad outcomes. And yet as the moon rose over Deadwood Crossing, he heard a distant sound of trouble, raised voices, hurried steps, and without thinking he stood, the badge already pinned to his coat before his mind could catch up with his heart, and he moved toward the noise, his presence alone enough to slow the moment, because authority, even worn and reluctant, still carried a certain gravity, and the men causing trouble backed down, surprised more than afraid, and the town watched as Caleb diffused the situation with calm words and steady eyes. No violence needed, just resolve, and afterward people began to speak to him differently, cautiously hopeful, and Caleb felt something shift inside him, a small spark he had thought long extinguished. And over the next days, Deadwood Crossing changed in subtle ways, people standing a little straighter, children playing closer to the street again, and Caleb took on the role he had resisted, organizing watches, setting rules, not as a man eager for power but as someone determined not to fail again. And the gang did not like it, their presence growing bolder, their warnings clearer, and Caleb knew the town was preparing for a reckoning, and he wrestled with the fear that he might lead them into disaster just as he had before. And one night Samuel asked him why he stayed, and Caleb answered with painful honesty, saying that running had not saved him, that living with regret was its own kind of prison. And as the threat drew closer, Caleb gathered the townsfolk, speaking plainly, not promising safety but promising he would stand with them, and that mattered more than empty assurance. And when the gang finally rode in, tension hung heavy but controlled, and Caleb faced them not as a man seeking redemption but as one accepting responsibility, knowing he could not change the past but could choose differently now. And though danger loomed and fear pressed close, he felt steadier than he had in years, because courage, he realized, was not the absence of fear but the refusal to let it decide the outcome. And as the sun dipped low and Deadwood Crossing braced itself, Caleb stood in the open street, badge catching the light, ghosts of failure close but no longer leading him, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that this time, no matter the cost, he would not turn away. Black Canyon cut through the land like a wound that never healed, its walls rising sharp and dark beneath a sky that always seemed a shade too dim, and it was toward this place that Elias Crow walked with a folded map pressed tight against his chest, his boots worn thin by desperation rather than distance, because he had chased hope across too many miles to turn back now, and the map had found him rather than the other way around, slipped into his hands by a dying prospector whose eyes held both relief and warning, a man who spoke of gold buried so deep it glowed even in darkness, gold that whispered to those who dared seek it. And Elias had laughed then, thinking fever made men say foolish things, until the whispers followed him into sleep that very night, soft and tempting, promising an end to hunger, an end to running, an end to the quiet shame of never having enough. And as he crossed the desert toward Black Canyon the whispers grew clearer, riding the wind, calling his name with voices that sounded familiar yet wrong, sometimes gentle, sometimes urgent, always persuasive. And Elias told himself it was only his mind, shaped by loneliness and need, but deep down he knew better, because the desert had a way of revealing truths men worked hard to bury. And when he reached the canyon's edge the air felt heavier, as if the land itself was watching, waiting to see what choice he would make. And Elias hesitated for the first time since finding the map, staring down into shadows that swallowed sound and light alike, remembering the stories told in low voices around campfires, of men who entered Black Canyon chasing fortune and returned empty-eyed or not at all. And still he descended, driven by the thought that a man could not outrun fate forever, only choose which face it wore when it finally caught up. And as he moved deeper the whispers changed, no longer urging him forward but questioning him, reminding him of promises broken, of people left behind, of moments when he had chosen survival over kindness, and each memory struck with painful clarity, because the canyon did not invent sins, it only uncovered them. And Elias found himself speaking aloud, defending choices long past, arguing with voices that answered too quickly, too personally. And when he finally reached the narrow vein of gold hidden behind stone and shadow, it gleamed with an unnatural warmth, lighting the canyon walls with a soft glow that felt alive, and all mixed with fear as Elias reached out, his fingers trembling, because he understood then that the gold was not cursed in the way men usually meant. It did not bring violence or madness by force, but by reflection, showing men the cost of what they desired most. And as Elias touched the gold the whispers fell silent, replaced by a stillness so deep it felt like judgment, and memories flooded him not as accusations but as truths he could no longer deny. And he saw himself clearly for the first time, not as a victim of circumstance but as a man who had made choices that shaped his path, and the canyon seemed to wait, offering him the chance to take the gold and walk away richer but unchanged, or to leave it and carry nothing but understanding forward, and tears cut lines through the dust on his face as Elias realized the terrible price the voices demanded was not blood or soul, but honesty, the surrender of comforting lies he had wrapped around himself for years, and he sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of that realization, and when he rose again the glow had dimmed, the gold still there but quieter now, patient, as if it would remain long after he was gone, and Elias folded the map carefully, his hands steady for the first time in days, and turned away, climbing out of Black Canyon under a sky that seemed lighter than before, the whispers gone, replaced by a silence that felt earned rather than empty, and when he reached the open desert again the wind carried only the sound of his own footsteps, and though he left with no riches to show for his journey, Elias walked on with a strange calm in his chest, because he understood now that some fortunes were meant to be refused, and some truths, once faced, were worth more than all the devil's gold buried in the dark.